And now for a brief history of slavery.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters. Before we delve into debunking this video made by American media company PragerU, here's a few things you need to know. Firstly, you should know, this video is a response to the PragerU video about the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and to specifically address the involvement of our African ancestors in the slave trade that further shaped the future of our brothers and sisters spread across the Americas and Europe in the First World today. This is an African's perspective. Sit back and enjoy the video.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people.
Yes, that's true.
It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner. Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
Well, here's where Mrs. Candace first gets it wrong. You can't tell history by nitpicking historical facts whilst ignoring the rest of the entire historical facts. During the period of the 14th century and the 19th century, slavery didn't just exist in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, it also existed in Europe. I wonder why she didn't include Europe. Well, Europeans also enslaved Europeans during the 14th century and prior to the 14th century. To mention a few, before and during the medieval period in Europe, the Roman Empire in today's Italy practiced slavery. There was also the Germanic and Celtic slavery. Also, Slavic slavery occurred when the Slavic people would take slaves from war captives. The infamous Vikings also enslaved other Europeans. I think we can all agree now that slavery was practiced by every race in every corner of the world. Please, let's continue.
The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave-master model was just how the world operated in the great philosopher's day. Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution.
Mrs. Candace gets it wrong again. Well, white people, like she said, weren't the first to abolish slavery in the history of humanity, according to recorded historical facts. The earliest recorded instance of a ruler or society abolishing slavery in some form can be traced back to ancient times. One of the earliest known cases of abolishing slavery was in the ancient city of Lagash in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, around 2300 BCE. King Urukagina, who ruled Lagash, issued some of the earliest known legal reforms, which included the liberation of enslaved people and the restoration of their properties. Another notable early instance of slavery abolition comes from ancient India. In the 6th century BCE, the founder of Jainism, Lord Mahavira, preached against violence and advocated for compassion towards all living beings, which included the liberation of slaves. This is just to mention a few instances, but I would say, if only Mrs. Candace had been more specific and said the Brits abolished the transatlantic slave trade first, and slavery generally in the 18th and 19th century, her statement about white people abolishing slavery would have been more accurate.
After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War. Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless. Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few. Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon. And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies.
Sit back and watch the part you've been patiently waiting for. Ancient Africans' involvement in the transatlantic slave trade.
On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not.
Wait a minute. What does Mrs. Candace mean by she wishes the ancient Africans lived like pharaohs in paradise? Well, Mrs. Candace, it is true that ancient Africans lived in paradise and their own developed societies filled with riches from natural resources such as gold, and a lot more. But that doesn't imply that every African on the African continent at that time being was rich and in paradise. I'm starting to think that Mrs. Candace doesn't know about her ancestral history prior to the transatlantic slave trade and prior to colonialism in Africa. While we can establish that not every empire was rich and like a paradise, like she said, well, majority of the great empires that traded slaves were rich to mention. A few tribes, like the Ashanti tribe now found in modern-day Ghana, were rich in gold that they literally traded locally with gold as a currency. Imagine gold being an actual currency. Also, tribes like the Great Benin Empire, now found in modern-day Nigeria, were so rich and developed that, by the late 1400s, the capital of Benin, Benin City, was already a large and highly regulated city. Europeans who came into Benin to trade were always impressed by its splendor and compared it to the major European cities at the time. The city was laid out on a clear plan. The buildings were reportedly all well kept, and the city included a massive palace compound decorated with thousands of intricate metal, ivory, and wood plaques, known as the Benin bronzes.
It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
Again and again, Mrs. Candace is net-picking history. It is true that some African elites sold war captives from neighboring tribes to the Europeans. But the part where Mrs. Candace says the Europeans never went past the shores of Africa, and they only bought slaves, is not completely true. Well, some European traders organized raiding parties or military expeditions to capture individuals from small villages and communities. These raids were often brutal, with violence and coercion used to capture slaves. These European armies had guns and shackles, and they were well equipped enough to raid some African villages on their own and brutally capture and enslave Africans. In fact, in certain occasions, some fathers were separated from their family lost. Their families and kids were also captured and enslaved also. So not every descendant of an African slave in the Americas or Europe was sold into slavery. And also I noticed Mrs. Candace awkwardly changed her tone of speech and said that the ancient Africans that sold their fellow Africans into slavery didn't care about her future, or rather the future of modern-day black people in the Americas or Europe. Well, Mrs. Candace, that's another inconsistency. You don't want black Americans to blame modern-day white Americans for atrocities committed by their ancestors. But yet by your speech, you seem to hold some grudge against ancient Africans while you go on and on to vindicate the ancient Europeans that started the entire transatlantic slave trade by saying it was a way of life back then. Well, if you establish that it was a way of life back then and wasn't known to man as a big crime back then, why will you make a statement like the ancient Africans didn't care about your future, or black Americans' future, if it was just a way of life for the entire world like you insinuate?
Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate that I could find. Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated. African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men.
Finally, she comes out of her shell. Notice how she highlighted that the same sub-Saharan Africa that sold slaves back then are still enslaving people today. What she's doing here is insinuating that since sub-Saharan Africans can sell themselves in the past, they can still do it today. Well, let's look into the word slavery. Firstly, the word slavery has evolved as time went by, and its new meanings can now be broken down into sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor or debt bondage, domestic servitude, forced child labor, unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. So I want you to know that when Mrs. Candace says slavery exists in Africa today, she's not talking about chattel slavery like the transatlantic slavery. She's talking about this new definitions. Also, it's so glaring how Mrs. Candace ended this video by demonizing we Africans by only highlighting the numbers of this new form of slavery in Africa, whilst ignoring the entire world. Some ignorant person would watch this video now and push the notion that the people of Africa are barbaric and slave owners. Matter of fact from Mrs. Candace and Praga Usource. We found out that these new forms of slavery exist in every part of the world. Here are the complete statistics from Praga Usource. This picture is taken from Praga Usource. A link to the official website will be in this video description. In fact, you'll be surprised that not only are there millions modern slaves in the Americas today, an estimated 1.1 million slaves reside somewhere in the United States of America today. This modern-day slavery is a global problem, and I believe if we work today as humans, we could put an end to slavery hiding in the shadows of our societies. I want to further say that false media advertisement, like how Mrs. Candace depicted Africa and Africans at the end of this video, are one of the major reasons why there's always tension and conflict between African Americans and Africans. African Americans unfortunately have a false depiction of Africa from inconsistent media coverages like this, and it creates a massive divide. You might think this is a conspiracy theory, but watch the next video of Black Americans reacting to this inconsistent information about Africa and see their reactions for yourself.
There are really more slaves in Africa right now than there were ever in America in the first place. And that
I just don't know, Candace.
But I don't know. That can't be right. I'm not willing to accept that. I need to go to Africa and see it by themselves.
Bro, you just looked it up on your phone multiple times. That's all I need to see. Carfax.
Yeah, man.
I don't believe that, man. It's just hard to believe.
Bro, it makes sense. There's a lot of poor people. They don't have developed countries. They don't have an
Third
industry.
world countries.
Like, think about it, bro.
You do hear about the, remember how Coney had them people and stuff?
Like, think about if I had bread.
You do say Africans are mean. Yeah, I mean.
Oh my god.
They're not all mean, but when they mean, they mean.
So
I gotta look it up just one more time, man.
yeah, bro.
This is no, man, no.
You fucked up? Why you fucked up for, bro?
Isn't that even how slaves
You a pure African, remember?
Yeah.
So it's my fault. I'm sorry.
I ain't know what you sorry for.
Okay, we know
Nigga,
that a lot
I'm
of
free
people.
now.
In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that.
And yet again, Mrs. Candace is wrong. She's so desperate in trying to vindicate the white race from participating in any form of slavery that she ignores the statistics from her own source that shows that over 5 million slaves are in the Americas, with more than 1 million in the United States alone. Mind you, this is excluding the number of slaves in Europe. I will urge you to check the statistics yourself to be aware of these growing numbers of slaves in our societies. Thanks for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe. Until next time.